Bueno, de vuelta, después de la hora del almuerzo.
Hello, we're back after the lunch break in Argentina, a little bit later in Spain, and an early lunch in the rest of Latin America. So we have a fantastic panel coming up. Lots of friends, coordinated by a TIC gal, Maria Jose Calvo, who is, she's a regulatory compliance manager at AT&T. And she will be presenting our panelists. And I'd like to say hello to the Undersecretary for Information and Communications Technology at the Office of the Cabinet of Ministers, who has helped us to organize this event. He's like one of our big hosts. I can see Majo in her home. Hi, Majo, how are you doing? Hi, Olga, how are you doing? We have a great panel. You have an hour and a half. But if things get interesting, we can go on a bit longer because there's a break after. As I said, it's a highly relevant panel because it's about infrastructure, without which there is no internet. And those who are working in Tier 1 are going to understand exactly what I'm talking about with fiber optics. Without all of that sort of thing, there is nothing else. No fake news, no social networks. We wouldn't have anything that we have now. So welcome, everybody. And I'll be here at the end to take questions. We're here with the technical support team for anything that you might need. Majo, over to you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank Olga and Adrian for the invitation and the honor of taking part in such a key event, which is happening in virtual form. At the same time, I'm going to be moderating a stellar team of professionals who have huge amounts of expertise in the sector. Each one plays a different role, which are all essential so that we can achieve development in the countries in the region. I expect lots of us are taking part in all kinds of virtual events and conferences where there are phrases that we always hear, like, for instance, hyperconnectivity, connecting the disconnected, infrastructure, reducing the digital gap. And all these words are very important for us to keep growing and to keep developing infrastructures within this region. So, as Olga said earlier, my job is to moderate a panel where each speaker will be telling us about the situation at the moment as regards infrastructure in the region, and which are the objectives and what is the outlook for the future development in Latin America in terms of infrastructure development. When I was organizing this panel, I realized that it was important to underscore a few key points when we're thinking about deploying infrastructure with regard to the development of the digital economy, when we're looking at reducing the digital gap. And amongst those, one of them stands out. For me, this is really essential. It's dialogue and cooperation between the different stakeholders to tackle the needs of the sector. Programming digital agendas requires cooperation between sectors. Otherwise, it's impossible to envisage this kind of growth in terms of the industry and the infrastructure. Another issue is municipal barriers. Now, what I mean by this is I'm not just talking about local taxes. I'm talking about bureaucratic processes, red tape, which delay the deployment of infrastructure in the most vulnerable areas. And when we talk about municipalities, I think we also need to look at educating people. You know, the business about installing antennas and how we deploy infrastructure in urban centers. Another issue which I think is important is how we assign the universal allowance. Now, the universal allowance service funds need to be based on projects where all the stakeholders are allowed to participate freely. We're looking at open tenders, and the main objective should be to ensure connectivity for the most vulnerable areas where perhaps the private sector, for lack of incentive, is not doing anything. Finally, and most importantly, we need to promote level the playing field for competition in terms of public policy making, so that investors feel safe when it comes to investing. We need flexible regulations, because obviously without investment, it will be impossible, or at least incredibly hard, to provide quality service to end users. Because it's a priority to give end users high quality connectivity. Now, as Olga said, at the end of the panel, there will be a few minutes. I think actually it's going to be 30 minutes for Q&A. So you can send us your questions on the Zoom chat, and we're going to be checking it from time to time so that we can answer your questions. Having said this, I would like to hand over to Anabel Cisneros, another ICT girl. She's a director of ARSAT, the Argentine State Telecommunications Company, and one of the first women to hold a management role in ARSAT. Anabel, welcome, and over to you. Thank you, Maria Jose, for the presentation. I'd just like to thank you for the invitation to the Argentine School on Internet Governance. This year, obviously, it's 100% virtual. I think it's been very challenging to organize this event, given the times we are living through. Luckily, I have already taken part in more than one event held by the South School of Internet Governance, as well as the Argentine School on Internet Governance. And I have to say, it's always a pleasure to be involved in these events and to discuss with the other stakeholders all the different aspects of Internet. Today, I am working at the ARSAT, the Argentine State Telecommunications Company, but I should also like to point out that it is a source of great pride for me to be the first woman on the board, but also to have presided the Internet Society, which I preside at the moment, and to play such a role in all the activities involved. So I want to share my screen with you. I've got a presentation about ARSAT. As I was saying, ARSAT is the Argentine State Telecommunications Company. Here's my screen. ARSAT plays a strategic role in the implementation of state policies and the universal access to information and communication technologies. Its mission is to attempt to reduce the digital gap and execute the Argentine state in digital policies and contribute to what we were saying earlier in terms of providing connectivity infrastructure, which is of high quality and high capacity, as sometimes it's difficult to attract private investments to this area. ARSAT is also the executive branch connecting those areas which would otherwise not be connected. One of the things that ARSAT is doing within the framework of its objectives is the law of the Argentine satellite industry. This law was launched the development of the Argentine satellite industry and provided guidelines for its development, and it has been declared state policy as a national priority and covers the building and operation of geostationary telecommunications satellites. And all of this is managed by ARSAT. Now, this plan was devised to meet the demand for services from 2015 to 2035, and the plan contemplates access to satellite communications and also the building of a new satellite. As you know, ARSAT is currently running ARSAT 1 and ARSAT 2 satellites, and the new law contemplates a third one, which will be part of our fleet of Argentine satellites. Initially, it was called ARSAT 3, but today, as from this year, it's going to be relaunched. The project is being relaunched. It's going to be called second generation ARSAT. And it's about changing the technological platform of the satellite, and it will also include a new radio frequency spectrum for satellite communication services. Currently, the satellites in operation are working on C and KU, but the new satellite will be working on the K frequency, and this means that it will be providing high-efficiency internet services, allowing for better spectrum efficiency. This plan, the 2015 to 2035, there was no actions were undertaken in 2019, so none of the plans moved forward in terms of the start of construction and the milestones involved in building a satellite. The satellite industry needs to be on the ground for many years in a country before a satellite actually gets built. We're about 4 years behind, actually. So the relaunch of this project in February this year means that we will be working to rather a tighter timetable than we had envisaged. It's going to be a little complex if we're going to make the deadlines for the satellite launch in 2023. Having said this, which has got to do with the enterprising spirit in the context of satellites, we also provide connectivity through the optic fiber federal network. This is the backbone of our services, which connects over 1,300 locations in Argentina and has over 33,000 kilometers of fiber optics throughout the country. This backbone is called the REFEFO, the fiber optics network, and it's state policy, which means attempting to reduce the digital gap between the urban centers, which usually have more than one connection opportunity, with those very small rural communities or remote areas which don't have any connectivity through fiber optics. So this is why this backbone is one of the connectivity pillars which the state is pursuing to provide access to internet fairly and equally across the board to all Argentines. I want to show you some numbers here. In August 2020, we have some 34,500 kilometers of fiber optics. This is dark fibers, as it's known. And 31,150 of these are already illuminated, and the others are on the way. This means connecting 24 provinces. And as I said, this is the wholesale transport, high capacity transport that we have in Argentina. High capacity wholesale transport is also low cost one. It's a solution when we talk about mega prices, wholesale mega prices, we talk about dollars, but obviously ARSAT, as an Argentine company, is working in pesos, Argentine pesos. One of the other services that the ARSAT provides is open digital TV, which has been implemented through the land digital TV service, and it provides free services throughout Argentina. Currently, the open TV, digital TV service offers 90 different stations, and it's over 60 kilometers of radio radius, and it reaches 80% of the population with all kinds of digital channels.
Distributed across the country. And as I said, since it has very extensive coverage, 80% or 84% of the terrestrial coverage is there. And we have 100% in the signal transportation coverage through the satellites. ARSAT has a data center. It's a national data center that has high capabilities with a Tier 3 certification. One of the few in Latin America. It's 4,500 square meters with 4 rooms of maximum security capabilities. It hosts all the national data and provides reliability and security, and provides services to third parties like hosting, housing, and infrastructure as a service. Most of the national state basically hosts the data in ARSAT, and some of them are about to migrate their data. And also we have private customers that are provided with the service. I'm going to mention briefly something that has to do with the satellite services that I was telling you about at first. Managed by ARSAT, ARSAT 1 and 2. Later, you will have the presentation with some of this data in terms of capabilities, the launching of the satellites, transponders, frequency of operations, etc. Our main objective in ARSAT, and to connect all Argentinians, ARSAT at present has many projects underway. For this year, for example, we have a third phase with the largest fiber optic network, and to extend the network or the fiber optics to some localities that do not have it right now. We need to modernize this network and to extend our capacity. The pandemic has shown clearly the lack of access to internet and lack of access to data that in turn basically had a spike in data traffic for ARSAT and for all internet networks across the country. So we need to serve this demand. In terms of open air TV, we have an investment plan to modernize the air TV network, the air channels, and also to modernize the hardware and software that is currently being used in these open air networks, and they should be phased out. In the data center, we have a service extension program, cloud services. And in satellite services, we have some initiatives to extend our capacity, especially primary care, healthcare, because during the pandemic, we have connected via satellite to all the CUB or the out-of-patient clinics to doctors and to patients. And also we provide access to internet in small localities that are remote, where they don't have any physical infrastructure, and we have no other way but to resort to a satellite connection. Here are the numbers of ARSAT SEG1. As I told you before, it's a high-performance satellite network with an electricity-based platform providing broadband to more than 280,000 households. It's an IP service thought to have a full capacity spectrum with particular access, leaving a small footprint, providing more capacity. So this satellite will have more than 60 gigabytes per second, and it would have a weight of 2,000 kilos. And we'll have a schedule, or we have scheduled the launching for 2023. I think my time is up, but let me mention this briefly. And in case there are questions, probably I can mention some other initiatives. For example, here I'm presenting a project that is very important for me and for ARSAT. It has to do with closing the gender-based divide or the gender gaps. So we created a technology initiative that has many pillars, and if there are questions with the gender gap, I can really take these questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anabel, and thank you for your presentation, because we are given only 1.5 hours. As you said, there are some questions in connection with the last topic that you touched upon, as well as other questions in connection with ARSAT. The presentation was very clear in connection with the activities performed at ARSAT and the initiatives that they have underway in your company. Right now, we will hear from Ariel Graizer. Ariel, Ariel is the president of the Argentine Internet Association or Chamber that is called CABASE. And probably you can tell us about CABASE, so you can describe what CABASE does and how it operates in Argentina. Ariel, the floor is all yours. Thank you, Majo. My last name is Graizer. I would like to thank Adrián, Olga, and the organizers, because it's always a pleasure to take part in these conferences. To tell you the truth, every time it's increasingly relevant for the times that we have here. Thank you for having invited me. As Majo was saying, I'm the president of the Argentine Internet Chamber, which is a non-for-profit association that gathers all members that promote the development of Internet in Argentina. Within our association, we have different types of members, all sorts of membership: national state, with the chief cabinet and the chief cabinet ministers, Ministry of Economy, state-owned agencies like the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, regulatory framework agencies, another 11 provinces, 25 municipalities. Also, we have the national universities, private universities, content generators, content creators, radios, TV channels, report producers, carriers, access providers, ISPs, all of those that develop the Internet of Things here in Argentina. And I would like to announce that we just launched last Friday the Internet of Things for the Argentine Internet Association. Is a spin-off of what the activities of CABASE are, because it's taking full speed. So basically, we have the IoT Argentine Internet Association. So we'll invite you to participate for those interested in developing hardware and software. We also have the entrepreneurs and the apps, or the developers of apps. And we have stakeholders that are small SMEs from the provinces and large multinationals that are luminaries that take part in our association. It's a non-for-profit organization, and the only objective is to promote the development of Internet in Argentina. So I encourage you to participate and to become members of our association. Now, infrastructure is what I have to address in this panel. Let me tell you that the Internet is the network interconnection. What works is not to have a single owner and not somebody that makes a decision managing the Internet across the world. And this is based on a set of rules that traces back to history created by a team of engineers that work in the Internet Engineering Task Force promoted by the Internet Society. I take part in this organization for the last 31 years. And the objective of which is to make Internet grow across the world. I'm working out of my tablet. I had an incident with my computer. Probably Majo can screen my PowerPoint presentation. Can you share mine? I'm sure Adrian can screen your PowerPoint presentation. Can somebody help me out with a PowerPoint presentation? The Internet is network interconnection. And network operators have to comply with a protocol. That protocol is BGP and is worldwide accepted as the protocol that we use, and I can exchange traffic with the network of the University of Buenos Aires. And every network interchanges traffic through that protocol. So we have backbones that exchange this traffic. Can you see that? CABASE in Argentina is an association that manages this information. Can you see that? Okay.
No, ahí se ve chiquito. Yo también la veo chiquitito.
Bueno, yes, we can see that. Okay.
Los detalles, yo no los veo por lo menos. Estoy en una pantalla pequeña de una tablet y no lo veo, pero bueno, yo sigo hablando. Entonces, nuestra asociación ha desarrollado
our association developed the interconnection backbone, and we have the backbone in Argentina that is the interconnection among all networks. This is produced by the interconnection of traffic interconnection points, okay, the IXPs. Today in Argentina, we manage 32 IXPs, and later I can show you the network or the backbone.
Le pediría que avance a la siguiente, por favor. Ahí está. Bueno, está muy chiquita, no se ve, pero
Well, you cannot see the map here, but it's the backbone with the 32 IXPs. Latin America, that I'm more familiar with because I'm part of the Latin America Internet Association and IXPs Association. For example, all countries have a network of many IXPs. Argentina ranks second. The first one is Brazil. Argentina has 32, and then we have many countries like Ecuador 3, Colombia 2, Peru 1, Chile 2. There and those and so forth. So they more or less have the same infrastructure, and they exchange internet traffic. Please, let me interrupt you and tell you that your presentation is screened perfectly well. Thank you for sorry for interrupting. No, it's okay. I didn't know that how well it was being screened. At least you can see the 32 IXPs. So CABASE basically measures the traffic in that backbone, the one being exchanged among operators, but we don't see the traffic managed by every single operator, but the traffic as a whole. It ensures, in a way, that there's no single owner of internet in a region. In Latin America, all countries have many IXPs, or at least one. And the networks, the national networks, as well as the international ones, for example, fiber optics, that run through many countries are interconnected to the IXPs, apart from the international carriers that provide them with traffic. So the internet service-based infrastructure, if we talk about the 7 tiers of the ISOSIC model, contemplates up to tier 4, because we speak that an internet is based on TCP/IP protocols, and the TCP is tier 4, so it's like the transportation tier. So the infrastructure that is available in order to enhance and to improve internet across the world, and basically in our region, is based on two things: physical network and interconnection. So it's very important. And that interconnection indeed follows a norm, a standard that is the less cost routing standard, generating the least cost routing, that it shouldn't be exchanged in another region not to pay transport cost. So it remains within the same region in order to be exchanged within the state, within the members or the stakeholders within a country. In 2005, when we provided services in Argentina, we exchanged traffic in Miami. So we had to pay a very expensive price, very high cost, and it was in dollars and in latency terms. That is the medium by which we measure how data is carried across a network. So we paid very, very costly. I mean, it was too high. And the latency, because we're exchanging traffic in Argentina and Miami. So 95% of the traffic in Argentina is being exchanged within the national network in Argentina, within this backbone. I mean, it would be difficult to have all the traffic hosted in our country, but most of it, it's being exchanged in Argentina. There's still some traffic that is not still interconnected. Besides, another thing that I would like to say is that the internet traffic has changed dramatically over the last years. 85% of which is video. So basically, we don't have so many applications managing the traffic. Just to mention a few, a movie in 4K definition, the last 1 hour, is equivalent to billions of emails or thousands of clicks on a website. So the megabytes create this difference. We have conducted a strategy in Argentina since 2011 that has aimed at bringing that content to Argentina. So 85% of the content, video content, that Argentine users watch is hosted in Argentina. So we have improved. Well, we made improvements to the latency, to the features in our network, and within our interconnection backbone, we have exceeded a terabit per second of traffic among providers, among vendors, but not every network's provider. If we add that, I mean, it's going to be multiple times the times of terabytes that is shared. We have 1 terabit of that we share. So the traffic of final users have grown exponentially. And we have grown over the last 4 years to having a growth rate between 50 to 60% annually. And let me mention something very important. In Argentina, we have declared the quarantine. We have declared a quarantine since March 20th. During the first 15 days, traffic grew 45%, equivalent to the annual growth. And then it remains stable. And right now, we have 35% more traffic than the one we used to have during the first 2 weeks of March. So we feel the effect, and we take pride in this because our backbone supported the unplanned growth, because networks are designed for the peaks and not for the troughs. And this fully supported this exponential growth of 45%. At the worldwide level, it was more or less the same trend, 38%, 40, 45%, 40 on average. And then it remains stable to lower levels in Argentina. We have 35% of traffic growth. This is important because if you want to understand how investments are made, as Anabel said, they are planned in the long term. They require a lot of money. 99% of those investments are made in dollars. You need to plan in the long term, and you need to have political goodwill in the state and in the private sector. So we're pleased that this backbone supported the exponential growth, and that in turn, we have the necessary planning to continue growing. Another parameter that I would like to mention, the effect that for those that manage networks and those that manage infrastructure consider very, very strongly. Regardless of how much internet provides to users, everything is consumed. That is not the growth rate of 50%, but the more capabilities you give to users, users demand even more. And this is a golden rule for the world and for Latin America. So this was infrastructure. Let me continue later on, but at least I would like to give you some statistics. Thank you very much, and I will be at your disposal to take any questions that may arise in the audience. Thank you very much. Very clear presentation, and I think that you explained quite well the internet growth and connectivity during this period of pandemic. During the Q&A, I will ask you some questions. And right now we will continue with Martín Olmos. Martín Olmos is the Undersecretary for Information and Communications Technology, Office of the Cabinet of Ministers for Argentina. Let's welcome Martín. Martín, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. Thank you to the organizers of Argentina and the South School on Internet Governance. For us, it's a great pleasure to be able to contribute to these events and to take part today in such an impressive panel with so many friends on it. With Anabel, I talk to her pretty much every day because we work together. Also talk a lot to Ariel, as well as to Maryleana, talk to her a lot. And as well, and Oscar León as well. We talk to him in the framework of the CITEM. So, Maria Jose warned me that we had a very diverse audience. Some people, some of those who are with us today are students in their last years on their university courses. Some people have a bit more experience in the ICT universe. So I just want to say in advance, sorry if I say a few things that for some people might seem to be a little too simple. In Argentina, in the Office of the Cabinet of Ministers, we have the Innovation Secretariat, and the ICT Secretariat is an undersecretariat of that, depends on it, and that's the area I'm in charge of. It's not the only organism to deal with regulation in the ICT system. We have an ecosystem, in fact, which is decentralized. It's ENACOM, which is the telecommunications entity. And as Anabel said, we also have ARSAT, which is the Argentine State Telecommunications Cabinet Agency. So between the three of us, we work together to design and implement the ICT policies in Argentina. Now, when we took office, our key objective was universal access to connectivity and ICT services. The reason for this is because, as everybody knows, in Argentina, as in throughout the region, in fact, most of the rest of the world, there are striking asymmetries of all kinds, socioeconomic ones, and particularly in Argentina, we have geographic asymmetries which are quite strong. We see connectivity and access to ICT services as a key element which could leverage development and equality. It's actually a fundamental tool in this sense, because if we can provide this kind of universal access to connectivity and ICT services, we will be able to overcome the other asymmetries that we are facing more quickly. Now, if we can't do this and just some people have access to ICT services, then sadly, this will turn into another factor which exacerbates these inequalities, particularly at the moment, where many of the gaps in terms of access to basic services such as health and education, work, where these are more and more dependent on connectivity. This is already true before the pandemic, but the problem is that now it has become far more of an urgent situation. Connectivity, thus, is incredibly important. I'd say that it's exceptionally important because it allows us to deploy other rights which are very important. The right to express ourselves, that's handled by connectivity these days, the access to information, to services, as I said before, basic services. And lastly, because it's a key element in terms of development and our future It's not just about basic rights and services, but also productive services, and production in general is also becoming more and more dependent on connectivity. For instance, an SME, in order to be able to export its services, has to have connectivity. And for Argentina, this is a strategic factor because being able to export more is critical for the country in order to avoid falling into these recurring crises which involve issues like foreign currencies. So that's the general view that we have of things. Now, as I said, when we took office, in a very short time, we found ourselves faced with the pandemic and obliged to handle this reality. Such a complex reality. So together with ENACOM and ARSAT, we took some measures with the idea of providing an answer to the challenges brought by the pandemic, which obviously put an awful lot of pressure on infrastructure, particularly fixed networks. This is the reason why we worked with some of the streaming platforms to get them to reduce the bit rate. This reduced, obviously alleviated pressure on the networks. We promoted agreements of mutual assistance, so to shore up infrastructure in the event of bottlenecks, particularly when it comes to wholesale internet ISPs providers. We also worked on issues regarding access. The pandemic had tremendous economic consequences, which affected so many people. So we sat down and worked with the ICT sector to ensure better mobile access, to help education, obviously, because the different platforms were developing educational content. And what we didn't want to happen was for that consumption of data should have to be paid by the users. So we took lots of measures in this area, and we also tried to work on some more long-term objectives, which looked beyond the pandemic. These came together in a plan that we called Conectar, Connecting, which was presented by the Argentine president at ARSAT. It's a plan which aims to put special emphasis on public investment in connectivity. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail at this point, because it's 4 pillars of those that have already been raised by Anabel, which have to do with getting the satellite development program going again, which will provide services, broadband services to throughout Argentina and improve connectivity. As its priority will be to bring rural zones, remote areas, geographically remote areas, where other kinds of connectivity, land connectivity, just can't make it. The idea is to bring them on board, and also the idea is to strengthen the fiber optics network in Argentina by increasing its capacity. Upgrading infrastructure, upgrading technology, all of this will help to massively boost the network's capacity, which obviously had a lot of pressure put on it by the increase in traffic at the start of the pandemic. But we're also going to be investing in expanding the network to reach more locations, more places, particularly small rural areas. As Anabel said, the ARSAT's pricing policy is geared towards making the service viable in very small places, villages, so that a major wholesaler can provide these services for cooperatives at an affordable cost, because these smaller companies are the ones that are actually providing the services to these homes in remote areas. We're also looking at investing in digital, open digital TV, which also involves upgrades to platforms, investments in maintenance, which hasn't been carried out for years. And all of this will allow us to have a strong digital TV, which will allow us to progress in the analog, moving out analog, so that we can start to phase that out. We're going to do this in stages. And also strengthening data centers, where the idea is to bring on board technologies that would allow us to store large amounts of data as administered or managed by the state, and which will also have better processing capacities, so make them faster, more agile, more efficient, so that they can help towards a better implementation of public policies. This requires, obviously, data centers that are able to provide cloud services for public administration and to certain private sector entities. These are the main points in terms of public investment for the plan, but this plan also looks at other issues which are key for investment, because we know that public investment is very important, because it reaches those places where the private sector lacks the incentives to reach. But we believe that the private sector has a key role to play here, because public investment can never replace private sector one. They should be complementary. They should dovetail with each other. So in that sense, it's very important for us to provide incentives for private investment. I don't want to avoid the issue here, but the Decree 690 has fostered certain concerns in the industry in terms of how the incentives look like and the current panorama. But it has to be said that the Decree 690 does have three elements. We're freezing the rates until the year end. It is an exceptional measure. It's one-off. And it's only in the framework of the pandemic. There had been an increase in March. I don't have to tell you at this stage what the social situation is like now in Argentina. Where the state is shouldering the burden of much of the salaries for many small and medium-sized enterprises, also some large companies too. It's helping to transfer funds to millions of people who have been very badly hit by the economic consequences of the pandemic, which have been pretty severe also on the health sector. So it's within this framework that this emergency decree was adopted. The second point in the decree is the declaration of public services in the sector, in the ICT context, which also prompted certain concern in some sectors. But we shouldn't compare this with what traditional public services are. We're talking about competing public services. We're not talking about monopolies. We're not talking about state systems. What we are looking at here is a mandate that access has to be universal. It has to reach everyone. And finally, there is the mandate to establish basic services which are universal in nature, to improve access for the entire population, which is something that we're working on. And lastly, we want to say that we are in a dialogue with all the companies in the sector, not just the large ones, but also the small and medium-sized ones, with the cooperatives. It's a very rich ecosystem that we have in Argentina, in the ICT sector. All of us working on the regulations contained in the decree with the idea of dissipating these concerns and creating mechanisms that are agile and efficient and do not discourage investment. And in addition, at the beginning, if you remember, I was telling you about the main aspects of the Conectar plan, which are basically about the public investment. But we are also working on something which we're going to be announcing shortly, which are regulatory measures to enable the deployment of infrastructure. And we're working on this at the moment on the partition, and new rules on deployment of infrastructure, rather as Maria Jose mentioned in her introduction. And these have to do with barriers at local municipal level. Then there's also a declaration of public services. Now, this is a legal support, if you like, so that we can implement mechanisms to facilitate the deployment of infrastructure throughout Argentina, working together with the local governments. So I don't know how we're doing time-wise. Yes, slightly over here, but don't worry, Martin. I didn't want to cut you off because you were talking about something that is so important, which is this decree. And I'm sure that there will be some questions about that coming up. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very clear what the government's agenda is concerning the ICT sector. So now we're going to hear from Oscar León. Oscar León is the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Telecommunications Commission of that's CITEL, of the OAS. So Oscar, over to you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. My acknowledgements to my colleagues, Olga, Adrian, and Oscar, for having invited me to speak here at the School of Internet Governance. I'm going to share a presentation. Please confirm if you can see it.
Perfecto. Se ve perfecto.
Yeah, right. Okay.
A ver ahí está.
¿Sigue la pantalla? Sí.
Sí, sí.
Ah, bueno, perfecto.
Can you see that?
Bueno,
yes.
Bien, yo creo que antes de mostrar los detalles del tema que me invitaron a el día de hoy,
First and
creo que
foremost,
es importante por los que nos estaban acompañando entender un poco que
I believe that we have to explain what CITEL is. and what it does, or the role they play within the OAS.
Bueno, lo primero que hay que decir es que la OEA es como el brazo
The
de
OAS
comunicaciones
is
de
like the
Gabinete,
telecommunication
de
branch of ICT.
Comunicaciones. Al interior de la OEA fue
inside the
en el año
OAS, and that was
1993,
created in
y lo que
2003, no, 1993.
trabajar en un marco,
So what we do is working on a regulatory
a
framework,
través de diferentes
countries through
formas. Unas son unas
different ways,
recomendaciones, otras son resoluciones,
guidelines,
y hay otros
resolutions,
de
recommendations,
que son las decisiones,
administrative
y hay otros
mechanisms
compartir las mejores experiencias,
like sharing
bien
the
sea
best
a través de procesos
practices
de discusión,
through
paneles entre
discussion
autoridades
forums,
de los 34 países de las
panels
Américas,
with the
y
34
también de la
countries of the
industria privada,
Americas,
un poco
and of the
más
private
adelante.
sector industry, as
Para
we're
poder
going
hacer
to see
eso, se
later.
tienen unos mecanismos
In order
formales
to do so, we
de
have formal
participación,
mechanisms
mecanismos formales para
of
poder
participation
tener
and
o
to
llegar a consensos y de alguna manera tener
reach
ya definido para
further
todas las
consensus and
justamente
clearly
esas políticas
define
de
for the
resolución
Americas
o
those
propuestas de
regulations or
resolución
policies or
en
proposals
países.
to be
Además
implemented in
del
the rest
lenguaje
of the
macro
countries.
regulatorio, se hace un trabajo
Apart
fuerte
from the regulatory framework,
en ese gráfico
we
ven
do some work
en el tema de acceso a las tecnologías de información
in
y
having
comunicación.
access to information and telecommunication technologies.
Y al inicio de este panel, y es
And
porque
at the very
precisamente uno de
beginning
los
of the
principales
panel, I
pilares para
mentioned
una
this
OEA es
because
la equidad.
one of the pillars of the
Con esa
OES
base de la
is
equidad
equality.
debemos buscar llegar con el beneficio social a totalidad de la
So
población en las
we
Américas.
could reach
Y es allí
the total
donde
population
a
of the
través de
Americas.
las cancillerías, los
And
embajadores que
through
hacen
the
parte
foreign
de la
offices and the
organización de la OEA,
ambassadors that are part
los mismos
of
cancilleres y
the
asambleas
discussions of the
parlamentarias
OAS,
trabajamos,
these
reciben la cumbre de las
officers
Américas en la que se
come,
reúnen los
even come
presidentes
to the
de
summit of
los
the
se
Americas
llegan a
with the
decisiones
President
que
of the
tienen
Americas.
impacto en los diferentes
They make
componentes de
decisions
nuestras vidas.
that have a very important component for our lives, like democracy, human rights,
Las telecomunicaciones,
telecommunications.
hay una serie de definiciones que se toman desde el punto de vista de las altas autoridades
In
de
this,
cada
in
país.
that summit, basically
Desea
they make
acerca
decisions
tener
that
mecanismos
in line
más
define the
operativos,
guidelines
mucho
for our
más
peoples.
técnicos, para que
So
funcionen los
we have
acuerdos.
technical guidelines
En ese
to
sentido,
make
hay
these
en
agreements
esta
work at high level.
solamente algunos pocos ejemplos, como el tema del
We have some
combate al
examples
uso y el tráfico de dispositivos
like
móviles de las
fighting
Américas.
cybercrime in
Personas
devices in the
que se
Americas, where
una cantidad
theft
importante de homicidios.
is
Obviamente,
basically in turn reduce
toneladas,
the
dependiendo del país,
homicide
otras
rate.
tasas, pues, ha reducido parte de esto, pero cuando no es
As
así,
the
la
in
cantidad de
during the
atentados,
pandemic,
daños,
basically this was reduced because
enfermedades,
most of the people are
ha
at
generado
home,
que inclusive se han tomado decisiones a nivel de las
and we
cancillerías, de los
even
ministerios,
made decisions that sometimes the foreign offices in countries became so involved to prevent
y
these sort of
dentro
wrongs
de
in the
otros
Americas.
elementos importantes dentro de
Another guideline in
trabajamos
developing
en
telecommunications
para el uso
that we
de
work in the
frecuencias
EOAS are
que pueden
agreements
ver como
for
los
spectrum use
el
in
corazón
the
para el funcionamiento de
frequencies,
las telecomunicaciones.
the positioning
Allí
of
donde
telecommunications,
es
etc.
importante homologar
For those of you that are not familiar with these
sus
concepts,
sus teléfonos celulares, la quinta generación que está siendo
the
adoptada en
5G
muchos países, pues,
networks that are being
necesarios,
adopted
a
across the
nivel de las
world
Américas, dentro de la ASIET,
require
una
certain
definición de una serie
things,
de
like, for
frecuencias y
example,
demás.
a set of
Hace
frequencies
aproximadamente unos 7, 8 años.
7 or
Se
8
crean los
years
satélites
ago.
funcionando, pues hay acuerdos previos que se tuvieron que haber llegado a nivel de las Américas y luego se llevan y se discuten.
Some satellites were used, and basically this is widely discussed within the telecommunication union. So this is key, harmonization of spectrums, and this is what we discuss in the Radio Communication Summit, together with the UN, that is the ITU, and we make the proposals in the Americas to advocate the guidelines that could be included in international agreement. This is a treaty of telecommunications. CITEL took more than 380 proposals in Latin America. They were widely discussed, and 98% of our proposal was included in this international treaty. So this is what we do at the core of CITEL. To do so, we cannot do this on our own. It is necessary that we have the support from the industry. And here on the screen, you have sponsors, or 100 sponsors, satellite companies, trade unions, ISPs, mobile operators, consultants. Between public organizations and privately held companies that make proposals together with us to finally reach a consensus to make proposals for the international treaties. Here you have some of them. If you read some of the names, most of them are world-class companies like Microsoft, Verizon, Facebook. Telecommunication operators that date back or that they have been in the market for a long time. So how do we do this? We have a structure of CITEL that is the one that you see on screen. We have the assembly, the meeting that is held on every 4 years. We had one in March 2018 in Buenos Aires. Why in Buenos Aires? Because the Secretariat of Telecommunication and its authority is responsible for telecommunications that hold the presidency. Basically, they hold the event in their city, and they hold this presidency for a 4-year time. So basically, Argentina is residing in the council of CITEL right now. In the technical part, we have 2 permanent councils. We have one for technology support and for the development of ICTs in the Americas, that is subcommittee number 1. And for the use of spectrum in satellite orbits. Here, Anabel participated in these activities and councils, and we basically propose the agreements that are going to be included in the recommendations, in the guidelines, or in the treaties for the Americas. We have Regulation and Policies Council, presided by Peru, and Council number 2, presided by Mexico. You have the spectrum regulator. Excuse me, but if this speaker does not use the microphone, I am not able to translate in this way, okay?
Tenemos una serie de grupos de trabajo. Aquí sí estoy seguro que ustedes no van a ver la letra a través de la pantalla, pero les comentaré, ustedes me van a creer lo que aparece aquí. Y la información que les estoy acá mostrando es básicamente para comentarles que tenemos una serie de grupos de trabajo, y estos grupos de trabajo lo que nos permiten es discutir sobre los temas puntuales que deseamos definir en las Américas. Por ejemplo, hay uno de política y regulación, otro sobre despliegue de nueva tecnología y servicios, hay otro sobre la preparación y seguimiento de las conferencias mundiales. Ahí tenemos otros comités que es el 2, el de frecuencia que les decía, que tiene también grupos de trabajo para el tema de servicios terrestres, otro para satelitales, otro para gestión eficiente del espectro. Para los que no están familiarizados con el tema de espectro, entendamos algo sencillo. Dentro de un carril en el que tenemos definido diferentes porciones para uso de espectro, si no logramos llegar a acuerdos entre los países, lo que va a generarse son interferencias graves en frontera que van a hacer que los servicios no puedan trabajar adecuadamente. O adicionalmente que los costos de los servicios sean completamente elevados, muy altos, porque no se han llegado a economías de escala, resultado justamente de homologar las frecuencias, homologar los equipos. Entonces, justamente son los acuerdos que hacemos a nivel de las Américas al interior de estos dos comités. Bueno, teniendo claro esto, entro ahora más rápido ya a las acciones estratégicas y es para entender un poco más a los acuerdos que hemos llegado con motivo del COVID-19, la pandemia.
Antes de empezar, perdón que te interrumpa, Oscar, nos queda un minutito para poder terminar porque ya estamos medios cortos para los que nos quedan.
Bueno, déjame, son 5 acciones, entonces déjame tratar de resumir en 3 minutos este tema. Entonces, las 5 acciones estratégicas incluyen, la primera de ellas, el de agilizar acciones para emplear cobertura de Internet y otros servicios. Aquí estamos hablando de acuerdos a través, como decimos, 8 mesas redondas, sentados ministerios, reguladores, la industria, y se discutió de manera práctica, un carácter pragmático, que se requería para que funcionaran adecuadamente. De allí se llegaron a unas conclusiones que están siendo plasmadas en acuerdos que se van a presentar justamente para la reunión que tenemos en 2 semanas, para que salgan ya formalmente como un acuerdo de las Américas, y eso incluye temas como otorgamiento ágil de permisos de espectro y en general para despliegue de infraestructura. Eso incluye el de compartición de infraestructura, compartir espectro, mercado secundario de espectro, acceso dinámico de espectro y otros elementos más orientados a la instalación de infraestructura. La segunda acción tiene que ver con la conectividad de puntos estratégicos y es acciones en las cuales se motivó que se haga o se tomen acciones para asegurar que tenga conectividad en hospitales, en centros de acopio de alimentos, acopio de medicinas, en sitios estratégicos que aunque uno consideraría que es obvio, realmente muchos de ellos no tenían las condiciones adecuadas e inclusive continúa el esfuerzo para llegar justamente con lo que se requiere a estas localidades, a estos establecimientos. La tercera línea estratégica es la de promover el adecuado uso de Internet. Esto es, no obstante, hay medidas como las que han tomado en Argentina, México, Perú, Colombia para tratar de tener un servicio que sea prioritario. El hecho de que se asegure esto no significa que se pueda tratar de utilizar de manera sin tener control del tráfico que está realizando. Por eso hay medidas de tráfico que vienen haciendo los operadores y con base en divulgación a la ciudadanía se les trata de enseñar, de informar de qué manera se va a hacer y tener los hábitos adecuados para el uso de Internet. La cuarta es sobre el tema de operación, mantenimiento e instalación, que también, aunque parecería algo lógico, resulta que muchas localidades, los que dan los permisos, los alcaldes o los que están en estas zonas, en cada región de los países, muchas veces demoran la instalación e inclusive han habido situaciones en las que salimos como ASIET con comunicados para explicarle a la ciudadanía que no hay ninguna relación, no hay ningún efecto de la 5ª generación con los temas del COVID-19. En Europa quemaron muchas estaciones base, hubo movimientos en contra de instalación de infraestructura y salimos justamente a aclarar que no hay relación entre estas dos cosas. Finalmente, la última estrategia está muy orientada hacia los temas de ciberseguridad y es inversiones importantes, no solamente para mantener y continuar con las necesidades de proteger desde el punto de vista de software los datos, sino también tratar de enseñarle a los usuarios, inclusive muchos de ustedes deben ser conscientes que en sus casas, cuando tienen los routers, los dispositivos para acceso a Internet, muchos de ellos tienen por defecto unas claves que vienen por defecto, bien por fábrica, y cualquiera que tenga el manual de sus equipos puede entrar y cambiarlo si ustedes no toman acciones y modifican las claves de sus dispositivos. Entonces, bien desde ese nivel de usuario hasta justamente inversiones y acciones importantes por parte de los gobiernos y por parte también de los operadores de telecomunicaciones. Corto acá para mirar los otros temas. Muchas gracias, María José.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Muy
Thank you,
clara tu
Oscar.
presentación.
Your
No me quiero seguir
presentation
extendiendo,
was
así que
very
vamos a
clear.
ir
I
ahora
won't go
con
on, so we
Alejandro
will move
Patiño.
straight on to Alejandro
Alejandro Patiño es
Patiño.
especialista en el sector
Alejandro
TIC,
is an
coordinador de la agenda
information and
digital para América
communications
Latina y el
technology
Caribe del
expert
año
at the
2020.
Economic Commission for Latin
Así que bueno,
America and the
Alejandro, te pido
Caribbean.
los 10 minutos de presentación porque
Alejandro,
ya
just
nos
10
estamos
minutes for your
extendiendo por el
presentation. I'm
tiempo,
afraid
aunque
we've gone
Olga
slightly over
me
time,
autorizó unos minutitos
although
más.
Olga has
Así que
given me a few
adelante
more
con tu
minutes.
presentación,
So
Alejandro.
go ahead, Alejandro. Thank you, María José. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I also like to say hello to Mariel, Martín, Oscar, and Ariel. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My presentation is I'm going to be sharing with you now. Hope you can see it properly.
Ahí se ve, ¿cierto?
Sí, perfecto.
Bueno, la idea de la presentación es, yo creo,
the idea of the presentation is to reinforce what was said earlier and talk a little bit about the access and demand gaps, underlining the importance of infrastructure and access projects, and put them into context in a reality of heterogeneous networks in terms of very varied demographics and structures which condition access to these technologies. And particularly in the case of the pandemic, these have become critical in order for people to continue to pursue their economic and social activities. Before we start, I should like to say that ECLAC is one of the 5 commissions dependent on the United Nations, founded in 1948 and based in Santiago. Its principal mandates are to support development in the region with various development cooperation mechanisms. It has the ELAC, which is a political framework about to turn 15 years of age, where periodically there are different policies, digital policies are discussed. So to move on, my presentation is about sharing with you some basic indicators from a publication that we launched a few weeks ago, where what we did was look at the issues of access in the context of the pandemic in order to see exactly what these gaps are and what measures are being taken by the governments in the context of the pandemic. And finally, to outline the role of leaders in this context. The first issue is that I'm sure that we all agree of the importance about digital solutions and the role that they play and how important they are. Everything that has to do with prevention and communication, platforms for teleworking, e-commerce, all those are solutions that work in terms of monitoring, virtual triage, healthcare, follow-up of patients. So digital technologies have been essential in tackling the pandemic and its consequences. And we've also seen a number of government measures in the political arena in order to tackle the pandemic. Although in terms of connectivity, as Martín said, Martín told us about what Argentina was doing, but the majority of countries have taken firm measures to improve connectivity and services provided. including spectrum frequencies and other policies. The pandemic laid bare the existing digital gap in the region, compounded by economic structural problems. There is still an important gap in terms of fixed bandwidth of 14%, whereas a third of the population has limited or no access to internet. 33% of urban homes are still not online. And this is much higher in some areas and certainly much higher in rural areas. And then demographic issues. There are two sectors of the population which are highly vulnerable in the pandemic: children and old people. 42% of the under 25 and 54% of the over 65 don't have internet. The other issue is affordability. If we look at the degree of affordability throughout the region, we can see that fixed and mobile bandwidth services, broadband services, represent up to 14 to 16% of per capita income in homes. And this is quite a serious burden, much greater than the thresholds in other countries, what we call reference thresholds of access to these services, which are in the region of 2% of costs. So these economic issues are conditioning people's access. Let us not forget that today there are some 32 million children who are unable to access teleschooling because they live in places where there is no connection. If we look at the data in terms of income, it's obviously much worse in the poorer areas. So over 90% of children in Paraguay, El Salvador, Bolivia, and Peru live in places without connection. And the difference, all it does is deepen the gap. Another gap has to do with the productive structure. Although many companies do use internet in the region, over 90% companies use and have access to internet. But if we look at other indicators, only 32% of them use internet to work with their suppliers, and barely a fifth of these use internet for e-commerce. These are conditioned by issues such as size and sector, and are obviously far worse in some sectors. Teleworking, working from home. We can see that this is a trend, one of the big trends, which is here to stay. But today, in Latin America, only 21% of people are able to work from home on internet, compared with 79% in more developed countries. This is a problem, particularly exacerbated by high levels of informal work. We think that maybe as much as 50% of unemployment is in the black, which makes the situation far worse. Another vision concerns of gap concerns the gender gap. What we have seen in the issue of gender, which is one of the a demographic gap, if you like. We've seen the low participation of women in STEM careers and studies, as well as employment in tech sectors. This data shows us the participation of women in ICT industries, and although at regional level, 1.6% of employment is male. When we look at it in terms of gender, it's almost half, 0.9%. The graph at the bottom shows us something similar in terms of the behavior of the online platforms, online jobs. We can see that in the region, if we look at supply and demand, there is quite a substantial gap in supply, particularly in those areas related to programming, for instance, or IT, in terms of men. But if we look at women in this sector, they only make up 25% of the labor force in these areas. So these are data which serve to underscore something that we already know, which is the low participation of women in these sectors, and obviously which are so important for the development of the ICT sector and its dynamics as a whole. To wind up and stay within the time allotted, which is a little bit short, I should like to underline the importance of digital policy making throughout plans being made today. We're looking at plans to reactivate the economy, and these technologies will be vital to continue tackling the pandemic and also to reactivate commercial production, trade. Well, I just wanted to touch on those points with you. All of this data is in a publication which we put out last week. So here's a link, you can download it and you can find more information about these indicators in this report. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you, Alejandro. I think that you made it abundantly clear how the pandemic has revealed even more the digital gap existing in the region. Thank you for staying within the time limits. And later, we'll have an opportunity to ask you a few questions about your presentation. Finally, Maryleana Jimenez, the Secretary General of ASIET, the Inter-American Association of Telecoms Companies, and as another of our ITC gals. Maryleana, over to you. And also, please, if you wouldn't mind staying within the time frame, so we have some time left over at the end to ask questions. Thank you. Off you go.
Thank you very much. My greetings to the Undersecretary Olga, Adriana, and Oscar. Thank you for being here. I have the privilege to be with this Intern the Government School since 2015. And this year, the pandemic did not allow us to meet, but at least the school is being taught. I'm going to share my presentation right now.
Perfecto.
Can you see that? Perfect. Very briefly, ASIET is an association that dates back to 2002, made up by private companies and public companies operating in the telecommunications sector. Our objective is to promote public and private sector dialogue to develop telecommunications and digital transformation in the region.
También tenemos un centro de pensamiento que es el Centro de
We have a think tank
de América Latina
for Latin America, where we conduct studies, strategic studies, and also we have consultants helping, gearing towards improvement, competitiveness, the market, and digital transformation in the region. Seeing that the school has the virtue of mixing professionals, the industry, and students, college students, I believe that they even included high school students this year, which I think is formidable. I would like to be very dynamic, pedagogical, and increase the complexity as I go along with the presentation. As Olga said at first, the internet infrastructure is the green tier, supporting the physical infrastructure of the network and the other elements that make up the digitalization. So let me define it. And here, I would like to define what the academy set of elements needed for the infrastructure to work efficiently. It doesn't work within the basis of telecommunications, that is tier, the basic tier. In line with the Internet Infrastructure Coalition, the infrastructure is the hardware, the transmission, and the software means to connect computers and users over the internet. Now, based on this premise, we understand that the internet has two types of infrastructure: active and passive infrastructure, which is totally different, and each of them bears different peculiarities or features. From 2008 to 15, more than 80% of the investment that was made in telecommunications was in the hands of the private sector, that is the market operators. Also, we have other sectors of the economy like transportation, energy, and water treatment, where transportation and water services are most of the investments, and those are public works. In energy, probably we have private partnerships, but in telecommunications, we know that this investment is made by operators. And I would like to underscore that there are two sort of costs: capital costs, that is the investment that I need to make in order to develop this infrastructure, and the operational costs and maintenance costs. So once the infrastructure is up and running, it requires further investment, plus the maintenance and operational cost to keep it working. If you analyze the active infrastructure, we have fiber, antennas, towers. To give you an idea of this density, across the world, we have 5 billion kilometers of fiber optics installed. This is submarine, underground, and in building. And if we suppose that we have 32 fibers per cable, we will have multiplied these times X. So it implies a lot of investment and a lot of money for operation and maintenance costs. And in passive infrastructure, it's exactly the same. That is support infrastructure, where we have private investment. We talk about the towers, the pipelines, the posts, all that supports and allows or facilitates this infrastructure to be mounted. In Latin America, we have 186,864 towers of telecommunications installed in Latin America. Out of them, more than half are telecommunication towers made by operators that do not belong to the operators, but they are being leased to those. And operators are the main component in this equation that is being regulated. Now, what happens with infrastructure investments for new technologies? When we talk about 5G, once again, we are considering OPEX and CAPEX, capital expenditures and operational expenditure and maintenance. Here, this trend shows is produced by McKinsey, and it shows that the growth of availability of fiber, of backhaul, that is transport fiber that takes information from one point to another, requires that you increase between 80 and 100% for 5G to happen. So the sum of CAPEX and OPEX, that is TCO, without considering the basic infrastructure equipment, that requires that for every percentage of speed growth, there's an investment in infrastructure that should be made. So if we increase to 25% the traffic, there's a 60% of increase in TCO, total cost of ownership. If it's 35, you have 110%, and for 50, you have 300% growth. This implies that the investment that has been made are high. However, from now on, with the technological advances, it will require further capabilities of the network, which is estimated that for a 5G network, you will have a 5-10-fold increase of the number of sites of these networks. This implies that if we want to keep managing the capabilities or still increase the capabilities of networks and connecting more people for everybody's interest, it will require more investment, more money, and the challenge that we're faced with is even greater. Statistics reveal that it will require $160 billion of investments in Latin America just to reach those levels of connectivity compared to the developed countries. That is, the investment in dollars required for these levels of connectivity is way too high. None of these components of the equation and none of the elements that are on top of the networks with public policies, together with all regulatory frameworks, considerations, the public interest, require to connect more people, who will consider that investments are so large that only together can we achieve this goal. And this will take us to the digital divide, something that was widely discussed here, which is merely the difference of connectivity and the use of ICTs with the individuals, households, and business, with two perspectives. One, geographical perspective, the locations, remote locations where it does not get there because you cannot recover investment there. And there are individuals, households, or companies that even being in those places where there is connectivity, they cannot use it because their income cannot cover the cost of having that connectivity. So here we have a digital divide, access divides or gaps, because I'm connected, because there's no availability. Also use gaps, because even though there's connectivity, I cannot use it because I cannot afford that. And there's an appropriation gap, even though I cannot pay for that. Or even if I can pay for that and I am covered, I cannot use it because it's not useful, or because I'm not aware of the true benefit that connectivity brings to the table. So we have stakeholders or gaps that are a moving target. One thing that we consider target or gap in the past, it no longer is. So from here now or from now onwards, with the new technological advances, we need to pay attention not to open new gaps. And when there's hyperconnectivity, as you said at first, in some locations, and there's lack of connectivity in others, all these elements, if you see the common factor lies in infrastructure. Without it, you cannot provide those services and benefits. Infrastructure has changed in time, and telecommunication markets have changed in scale, in scalability, the number of lines of communication, points of access, density of infrastructure by square kilometer, etc. And we have differences in the levels of competitiveness because they were highly competitive or natural monopolies. I mean, a new entrant cannot enter the market. However, when new mobile telephony services, you have new entrants in the markets of multiple operators invested in this sort of infrastructure. On the other hand, you have a change in services. Before, the services basically depreciated that infrastructure. If you had a telephone line and the fixed land telephony, that service basically was depreciated and paid for the infrastructure. However, right now, we have a large set of services in these upper tiers, especially in tier 3. There's a large number of services with a multiplicity of stakeholders and with a business model that is totally different from the past. And here, we say that we have the telephone operators, historically the ones that are being regulated across this equation, which takes me to the role of the regulator, that is the public agency that has the responsibility to advocate for this telecommunications market and to install the necessary incentives, which has changed already. And if it has done so, it has to do it so it becomes, instead of a regulator of command and control, to promote investment, because the investment is so large that it's necessary to promote these incentives on the part of public agencies to make this true. So it requires more legal certainty, less risk of investment. The more risk you have in investment, the more expensive the financing and the investment, and also the more expensive developing the basic elements. If we address the pandemic, investigation reveals, by Standard & Poor's, based on an economic model, how much these operators might have lost in Latin America. Standard & Poor's reveals that 2.6 and 14% or 14.2% have their income reduced, depending on many factors, but we can talk about lockdowns, we can talk about local currency devaluations, difficulties for developing new infrastructure, which may limit for this year the capital investments that are so necessary, primarily focused on the strategic elements, and they could change between 10 and 20% in negative numbers. So we have the whole picture. We have the infrastructure as such, investment required, and is made by the operators, that the investment required to reach those developed countries' connectivity that is so high, and we have the commitment to close the digital divide. And on top, we have a pandemic that is affecting the entry of new operators. So here, some highlights. Operators require more stability and legal certainty in order to make the necessary investments. And that at the core of infrastructure, there should be public and private investments or partnerships, focusing on the long term rather than the short term, and especially covering the lack of revenues or the lost profit because of the pandemic. So the countries need to promote this together. The use of public resources for closing or for bridging the digital divide. If we invest enough, it should be supply and demand, infrastructure, and the possibility of giving support to these families that do not have access to the service. And apart from that, these approaches need to be highly focused based on poverty data. They need to be very targeted or narrowly targeted, not to have any distortions in the market and not to have losses of carriers, because their interest is to continue connecting more people. That is the logic or the rationale that is behind this business. So for this, we require technical regulations that is predictable. We talked about the telecommunication networks, and here we have a set of elements for you to review. Once you have the presentations. And here, I would like to say that we have to resize the role of the carrier, incentivize and promote investment, especially legal certainty. Thank you. Thank you, Maryleana.
Your presentation was very clear. Thank you. Sadly, we are up against the clock. Olga is asking me to wind up the session. So she will take any questions for this panel, and then we'll exchange them, because actually we have very little time left. Each one of the speakers has been very clear in the way they shared what they feel are the priorities and needs of the sector to continue promoting connectivity throughout the region. It's been a very rich dialogue where each person has laid out the fundamental concepts and needs, as I said, the priorities required to continue to promote digital transformation in the sector. I think it's vital, as Maryleana said, it's very important that we have these alliances between the private and public sectors to continue to foster investment. And it's imperative, from my point of view, that there be public policies able to guarantee a digital ecosystem which is at once strong and competitive. Thank you very much to each of the speakers. It was a pleasure for me to be able to moderate this prestigious panel. And now I'll hand over to Olga so she can close the panel and move on to the next session. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. We are all slaves to time. So we're in a TV studio here. It's exactly like the TV. We are slaves to time. We have another panel in 10 times, and when we need to set it up, we need to sort out the video and TV frequencies. I think we could hold a whole conference on this subject. I would like to thank Ariel, Anabel, Maryleana, Martín, Oscar, Alejandro, and of course Mario Jose for their participation and their contributions. But the weird thing about all of this is there's a lack of applause. So the real applause at any rate. So I'm sending you greetings, wishing you the very best, and we'll see you in the cloud. We'll be back in 10 minutes with the next panel looking at the Internet of Things and 5G, followed by the session on the Wi-Fi of the future.